In this topic, let's talk about branching. Now, it's inevitable when we have multiple developers working that we're going to have code conflicts in a process, even in a DevOps process. The more people that work in the same system, especially if they're making more rapid changes or smaller changes, the more likely it is that somebody's going to write code in the same area, the same module, same object as somebody else. It really doesn't matter how well we coordinate our efforts with project managers or Kanban boards or any other tool. We're sometimes going to end up making changes to the same file. Years ago, this was a problem in application code design or in writing software. And what we've done is we've evolved in most version control systems to use branching and merging to help ensure that developers don't lose any work, but they're not being blocked by other developers who are not trying to work in the same file and receiving some sort of conflict. Branching and merging also allows us to reconcile those code differences by separating the code or putting it back together as needed. The first part of this branching is a software development technique that essentially makes a copy of the source code for a developer or multiple developers. It allows them each to work independently of everybody else. Typically, this is a complete copy of all source code as of some point in time, and it can be changed and compiled and worked on independently of the work done by anybody else in another branch. Any changes made in this branch or another branch are not reflected in each other's branches. They're not reflected outside of the branch where the changes are made. It's a completely independent copy. And any changes that we want to keep have to be merged back into the code in a different branch. Each copy of code is called a branch, kind of like the branches of a tree. And in modern software, we typically return to the main branch or the reference branch as the master branch. Some people still call it the trunk, and it depends on which version control system you use as to which terminology you may choose. Now, we create other branches for specific purposes. We may create a branch for a developer to work independently. We typically may call this feature branches. We may create a branch that's going to hold all the changes that we're going to deploy to our production system. We typically call this a release branch. We may create a branch that is a copy of all the code at the time we release. And this is a branch that we use for hot fixes or patches to production. Certainly, there are other types of branches as well, but which branching strategy you use depends on how you proceed with your development. As we mentioned, each one of these exists independently, but the version control system manages the versions of all these files and keeps track of which versions are in which branches and what code has been merged. They're usually very efficient at doing this, so the actual physical number of copies sometimes is rarely what you expect. We typically don't have any resource concerns for disk space or multiple copies in modern software development. The version control system manages that. Now, eventually, all the code that we want to keep is going to be merged back into the master branch, and we'll then deploy it or do something else. The good news is that database code can fit into the same types of branching and merging strategies that most developers employ. We've seen in other modules how we can store our code in a version control system, and so we can extend that to include branching and merging strategies. Now, the bad news is that merging database code is more complex than application code, kind of because of the nature of the SQL language, and also because of the nature of databases and the need to maintain state. We'll talk about different branching strategies in another module.